Hello and welcome to yet another episode of the Black Archive Visual Podcast, episode 10, which is made possible by the Harvard South African Fellowship Program run through the Center for African Studies here at Harvard University. For exciting events and all things Africa at Harvard, I encourage you to visit our website at www.africa.harvard.edu. Detailed information on opportunities for fellowships, funding for undergraduate and graduate programs, as well as exciting research and public engagement listings can be accessed on our website. I am Siseko Khumalo, your host, and a visiting fellow of the Harvard South African Fellowship Program and a lecturer of philosophy at the University of Fort Hare in South Africa, where I teach on social and political philosophy, feminist and queer theory, decoloniality, and the Black Archive. Today, I am joined by a very special guest, D1 David Augustin, of course, who's better known for his stage name, D1, and he is this year the 2022-2023 Nasser Jones Hip Hop Fellow at Harvard's Hip Hop Archive and Research Institute, housed within the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. The award was first given in 2013 and is named after the rapper Nas, who just happens to be D1's favorite rapper. D1 has been on both sides of his research as an educator as well as a hip-hop artist. Born and raised in New Orleans, he attended Louisiana State University and began rapping while in college. When he graduated, he became a middle school teacher in Baton Rouge for a couple of years until he resigned to focus exclusively on his rap career, which meant, of course, the music was going quite well. Throughout his life, he's been seen firsthand how gun violence affected his community, and he has had best friends get murdered because he said they were trying to live the lifestyle that was being rapped about in hip-hop popular music. David, before we get into the conversation, I want to ask you about D1, right? So could you tell us where the name comes from and what it means to you?
Yes, D1 is a double entendre. It's an extension of my first name, which is David. So I started rapping when I was a college student at Louisiana State University, and LSU, as we call it, is known as a D1 school or a Division I school. If you're an athlete, a high school athlete, you know that oftentimes your goal is to play your sport at a Division I or a D1 university. That's like the top of the food chain. So as a high school athlete, my goal was to go to a D1 school and to be able to play ball there, right?
Yeah.
So that's part of the name. The other part of the name comes from David and from my spirituality, which really preceded me even wanting to get into the rap game. My spirituality really just made me want to lead a purpose-driven life and to ultimately live a life that would make good use of my time and my talents while I was here on earth and make God proud. So when I started to rap, I felt like I was the one that was chosen to get into this game, to change the game. So instead of the one, I took the D from the name David, and I said I'm D1.
Thank you for sharing that story, because I was wondering about it. And you and I met initially through the Hutchins Center, right? African and African American Research. And when we initially met, one of the things that kind of stood out for me was what you said about your project. And of course, your project at the center is looking at the focus of music and how to better use music as a teaching and catalytic tool for social transformation. And that interested me because of the research and the work that I do specifically around the Black Archive, right? I conceptualize music as a tool, as a repository tool, in terms of telling our histories, as well as telling our stories as Black communities, because Black communities generally don't have access and means to platforms of knowledge production, right? We're systematically and continuously excluded, specifically in South Africa. So in the 1950s, what happens in SA is that we kind of get this thing where Black South Africans are told you're not allowed to go to university. In 1959, there's the introduction of the University Extension Act, Higher Education Extension Act. And that basically establishes what we call bush colleges, right? And bush colleges were meant to kind of prepare I suppose, teachers, police officers, nurses, kind of professionalized labor that would service black communities. And so black folk were kind of systematically excluded from really developing knowledge that theorizes their communities. But what happens is that in the artistic world, there's a lot that's happening with music. Resistance poetry is coming out of, incredible studios. Miriam Makeba is touring the world. She becomes a UN ambassador, kind of resisting what the hell is happening in South Africa through her music. She gets banned by the South African government. All of these things just because she's a musician. So I guess the long and short of my initial question to you is, could you share with us the vision that you had when first you applied for the fellowship in terms of wanting to do this particular project that you're working on at the Hutchins Center, but secondly, how that feeds into a broader conversation of how you have conceptualized and used your music to speak to the realities. Part of your biography indicates that you got into this because you wanted to shift the gaze in terms of how your friends were emulating the lyrical compositions of what they were hearing in the music that they were listening to. So I'm curious about those two things, the history of where your project comes from, but also how you then kind of envisioned this project here at Harvard at Hutchins.
For sure. So in terms of the history, when I was a middle school teacher, when I first graduated college, I was firsthand in the classroom every day witnessing my students put more energy into learning the lyrics of their favorite hip-hop songs than they were putting into learning their lessons that I was teaching them. Mm-hmm. And I saw this firsthand every day. I was witnessing my students emulate the haircuts and the hairstyles of their favorite artists, emulate the slang of their favorite artists, even emulate the same tattoos that their favorite artists have. My students were actually, getting tattoos that were a mirror image of what some of their favorite rappers had tattooed on their body. That let me know that hip-hop had power that extended far beyond just entertainment value. Mm-hmm. It had life-altering power. I understood that when my best friend got murdered, which was right around this same time, ironically, it was during the tenure where I was a teacher, I understood that my best friend took a path in life that was really influenced by some of the music that we were all listening to when we were kids, right? So I asked myself, what made that music turn into a lifestyle that he tried to emulate, whereas for me, that music was simply just a soundtrack to something that, gave me something to listen to before my basketball games or when I would work out, Mm-hmm. So I was really intrigued by the power that hip-hop had as a teaching tool and even what causes it to hold a different level of importance in various black people's lives. Mm-hmm. So it was real-life experience. When you see one of your students come in class with the same tattoo that his favorite rapper has, and he's in middle school, it's like, my goodness, do these rappers understand how much power they have? And then if they do understand it, do they care about what direction they are contributing to leading some of their impressionable fans and followers in? And so that motivated me to want to be a rapper.
Okay.
Because I didn't want to always be a cultural I would say a cultural, not even critiquer, but I didn't want to be a cultural
Observer?
Not even observer, but just a person who always had a level of tension, with the culture, to where I could never be like at peace with what my role was to be inside the culture. See, there's a transition when you go from fully consuming everything that the culture is putting out in terms of the music, and you're consuming it, you're memorizing it, you are excited about it. But when there's a transition that occurs to where you still have a taste for it, but now you know better, and now you're actually able to internalize and digest some of the messages and some of the implications of these messages. Now you get to a point where it's like, how do I coexist with something that I love and have a taste for, but that I also realize it's not completely healthy for me or for us anymore? And that's the space I was in. So that unique space, I don't even know what to call that space, but that unique space made me say, I want to now take on another role, which is to be a participant in this sport of hip hop. And that's what made me want to become a rapper professionally. Because I said, well, I can make some of the music that I would like to hear, and I can represent a narrative for black men that I don't hear represented enough inside of hip hop. I can be that person that represents a black man who comes from the streets, but who is a proud college graduate, who is a man of God, and who can coexist with our culture, but still critique our culture. And it's a nuanced relationship when you coexist with something, but then you can also critique it at the same time from an authentic place of love. I wanted all of that, so that's what led me out of the classroom
into the studio.
Into the studio to being D1. And I heard you say something in the intro. You said, when you left the classroom to make that jump into the music industry, you said something to the effect of, it must have been like successful for me at the time in order for me to make that jump.
Yeah.
It was not successful. When I chose to make that jump, I had never made a penny off of music in my life.
Okay.
So when I chose to make that jump, I'm leaving a stable career with a salary, with healthcare benefits. Socially, it sounds really good for my mom and my grandma to be able to brag and say, oh yeah, little David, my son, my grandson, he's teaching now. He's doing really well. His students love him. These are all very comfortable places of existence, financially, socially, like it just feels good. I gave all that up and all that stability up to jump into this industry where there are no rules, where there are no morals, values, or principles that people are forced to abide by in terms of ethics. There's no guaranteed success track of saying, oh, if you put in this many hours in the studio, you're guaranteed to become this successful. None of this. So I jumped into the water with piranhas, and it was because of a firm desire to make more impact than I was able to make simply as a teacher. I still wanted to be a teacher, but
in another medium.
In another medium, there you go. And the medium of hip hop, to this day, I can't think of a better medium if you truly want to be a teacher and impact the youth, especially black youth in this country, but even adults at this point, because since I stopped teaching, hip-hop's influence has only grown and expanded. So I'm very glad that I made that decision. There's a lot to unpack about what made that decision successful, because there are many who attempt to make that leap and it doesn't work.
Now, David, there's a lot that you've said in answering my question and that I want to kind of latch onto, right? But I think the first one for me that stands out quite a lot is your critique of hip-hop, and what led you to hip-hop is an observation that you wanted to nuance what black masculinity looked like, right? So, and I find that fascinating for a number of reasons, precisely because I think how we tend to conceptualize rap, hip-hop, and how it's been exported is in a very, very particular kind of cultural stereotype of the black male rapper and the associations that we then ascribe to that. And I guess my curiosity there lies in, what was it for you that, and of course I ask this question necessarily because you are a black man existing in the United States. And whether you're a black man existing in the United States, if you're a black man existing in a white settler colonial society, and I would classify the United States as a white settler colonial society, your mother always advises you how to act in public, how to walk, how to talk, just because black women have been constantly afraid of the fact that as black men we get killed by the public. So what is it, I think for me, at what point do you make that realization? Because in as much as, for example, and I think some of us, I can easily say the reason why I got into academia, the reason why I became a philosopher, is because of those conversations where I'm thinking with my mother around the fact that I want to have a long and prosperous life in the context of South Africa, right? So at what point do you kind of come to that realization of there's something happening in terms of the kind of stereotypical reproductions of black masculinity that is coming out of hip-hop, and I want to intervene on that, right? So, or I want to disrupt that, I want to challenge that. At what point do you have that recognition? I get the teaching, of course, to say, yes, I want to be a teacher, but I want to teach to a broader audience as opposed to 30 students every single year who are in my class. Or maybe, say, if you're teaching a particular grade in middle school, maybe 120 kids, right, who are in that grade in that year. I get the teaching impetus. But at a personal level, what is it that, as you said, Lil David clicks in his mind that says, but I am a black man and I'm far more nuanced than the tattooed, cussing, drinking, smoking, carrying guns, violence, culture of violence. I'm more than that, right? I am red, right? I understand and appreciate the complexity and the cultures or the complexities of my culture. I am a young man who is part and parcel of the church. At what point do you kind of like, that's the kind of message that I want to preach using this particular tool that has such an incredible reach?
That's a great question. So when I was in college, that's when I underwent a spiritual transformation. I went from being a young man who was, like you said, reared in the church, but mainly just attended because it was tradition and because I was told to by my mother and my grandmother. I went from that to now living on my own, moving out of New Orleans, where I was from. And as I'm attending college, life really hit me in a way that I wasn't sheltered by the umbrella of my family to deal with these tragedies that occurred. So over the course of 12 months, I had a best friend get murdered. I had my girlfriend at the time, who was like my first love, and I literally went to college to be with her, to continue our relationship, end up cheating on me. So that, that really impacted me. Also, my identity had been built on being the star basketball player when I was in high school. Everybody knew me. Everybody understood how great I was in basketball, and I get cut from the team in college. Yeah, so I go to this school chasing behind my girlfriend and chasing behind my love of basketball, my other love, and both of them
kind of betray you.
Betray me, there you go. They both kind of betrayed me. So all of these things happened. And then my friends who I had, who were known as my clique and my crew, who I went to college with, a big group of us, they ended up making some different life choices when we got to college. My roommate, for example, started selling drugs. This was my friend from high school. And I'm like, bro, we're in college. We are here for a totally different reason, to better our lives, You are putting us in harm's way. You're selling drugs. You are jeopardizing everything that we are here to accomplish. And so we ended up, falling out, and that was a tough moment for me. With all of these things happening within a 12-month span, what it did was it led me to find my identity in something that couldn't be stripped from me. The title of the star basketball player or the big man on campus, when it comes to sports, that had gotten taken away. The title of, I'm in this relationship with this beautiful woman, this is my girl, that got taken away from me. The title of, I'm part of this clique with a whole bunch of these guys and we're all super tight, that got taken away from me. The title of, hey, this is my best friend from childhood, that got taken away from me. He got taken away from me, that is when the spiritual transformation occurred, to where I found my own relationship with God at that point. Not a relationship that was being forced upon me by my parents, not something that anybody was telling me, hey, this is going to get rid of all of your problems instantly, but just something in a really authentic, meaningful way that I understood not only who God was, but what my purpose was for being created. And once I understood that my purpose for being created was to glorify God in everything that I do, whether it's a one-on-one conversation that no cameras are present for, whether it's in front of 10,000 people at a stadium where I'm performing, whether it's in the classroom as a teacher, or whether it's in the grocery store as a patron who's holding the door open for someone. Once I understood my purpose in life, it made sense that anything I do, I have to be able to draw a line between what I'm doing and how it's going to glorify God.
Okay.
So at that moment, when I began to create music and start rapping, it became second nature for me to want to show that I am a more nuanced black man than what you all may be used to seeing. Because I'm not here to do anything other than glorify God and utilize the talents that God has given me. Through doing that, it's automatically gonna make me a minority and make me stand out in an industry that doesn't really want to hear about that, doesn't really want to see that. So from the beginning, I knew that this was the narrow road that I was choosing to take. And I also knew that this was the most authentic road that I could choose to take. So on my first album that I ever put out, it's called I Am Who I Am. The first song, I literally say in the first verse of the first song on my first album, I say, if I'm supposed to rap, God, please let me blow. But if I'm not supposed to rap, please let me know. And that right there is something that I sincerely meant. I was like, before I go even any further, before I create a second, third, fourth album, I just put my 9th album out last month. Before I created any more, I sincerely meant that as a prayer, and I put that in the first bars of my first song, because I didn't want to just have this be a David mission that I was on. I wanted this to be a divine mission that I was on. And if God was going to ordain my journey into this industry and the moves that I would be able to make while in it, then I was like, I'm all for it, because I love hip-hop. I see how I can make impact and have influence. But if this wouldn't be the best route for me, God, by all means, don't allow it to prosper, and I will go and do something else with my life, you know? And I had that peace before I ever set foot in this industry. That's when nobody knew me. That's when I was a local rapper. And I got my answer, you know?
Which is to say,
I got my
you got to
answer.
keep on doing what you're doing. And this brings me to another part, and we're going to get into the real meat of you know, your most recent album, but also just the general kind of history of your music. But before we get there, I wanna ask another biographical question, right? New Orleans is a cultural melting pot, right? It's diverse, it's rich, it is one of the spaces that is celebrated precisely for the polyphonic nature of how not only people understand themselves, but understand themselves in relation to their spirituality, right? And that's, of course, because of the history of the city. What was it? Okay, I guess the question that I'm trying to get to is, does that rich historical heritage of coming from New Orleans, I understand the part about the church, and I understand growing up in the church, but are there other avenues, right, of being in New Orleans that kind of appeal to you in the process of creating your music, specifically just because of as I say, the spiritual and cultural diversity that is definitive of that space?
Being in New Orleans, is a spiritual experience in and of itself, because the richness of the culture down there becomes part of your DNA. And what it does is it allows you to understand that we are different than anyone else on the face of this planet. And you wear that as a badge of honor when you think of being from New Orleans and how resilient we are and how rich we are culturally. And with that badge of honor that you have, if you choose to create something to where you're going to represent New Orleans and be a torchbearer for the city of New Orleans, you have to go above and beyond to make sure that you are adding to the rich heritage that we already come from. So for me, that was another thing. I'm standing on the shoulders of cultural creative giants who come from here. And many of these cultural creative giants aren't even known to the world. The best musicians in the world who come from New Orleans may not even be world famous, but they may just play in the French Quarter or on Frenchman Street on a nightly, weekly basis to where everyone in the city knows who they are. But oftentimes they'll be like, I'm not even worried about world fame. I just want to be the man in my neighborhood and in my community, because that right there brings them a level of prestige and a level of peace that people are often content with. I wasn't content with just being a neighborhood superstar, because I understood that people all over the world need light. In this dark world that we live in, people need light as much as possible. And I just enjoy the opportunity to be able to shine my light for whoever it may be meant to reach. And that's always been my goal. So, you know, coming from New Orleans is something that I don't even think people understand how resilient it makes us, how much grit we have. I felt like the underdog my whole life, but the type of underdog that knows that he is special and
Gifted
and
talented.
there you go, like just knowing that, like, yo, I'm the most unique person in this whole room, but at the same time I'm the most slept on person in this whole room. Man, that's such a unique nuance right there. And when this becomes, you know, apparent in every new scene and setting that you set foot into, it's like, wow, this is actually a superpower that I have.
Yeah, for sure.
And I've started to embrace that more and more as I have grown and matured, is that being slept on by people shouldn't make me doubt
yourself and the
Yes.
gift that you have to give to the world.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And it shouldn't make me dream smaller either.
Yeah.
It shouldn't make me say, well, you know what? They're sleeping on me at Harvard, so let me just go back to New Orleans where, you know, everybody knows who I am, and that's easy. It's like, no, it makes me say, oh, bet, they're sleeping on me at Harvard? I'm going to wake them up.
Exactly. And I think one of the things that for me stands out in what you've just said is precisely one of the reasons why I conceptualize the Black Archive in the way that I do, right? What our music did, and we saw this in the civil rights movement in the United States, in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, what the musicians, blues, jazz, in South Africa we have even Baqanga, resistance poetry. What it did was that it allowed for our artists to become quote unquote social healers, right? In contexts where our communities were in heavily, heavily dark moments, right? So, for example, I always think of, you know, the South African song of Sophia Town. There's a rendition of what is it? The arrests of the, what do they call them again? Of the Tarvan raids that Mafikizolo did in the early 2000s called Kwela, right? What all of this music is doing both, and of course, I think the most powerful, at the time, the most powerful pieces of music that are coming out, you know, you've got Miriam Makeba collaborating with Belafonte here, and she does that incredible song, Gwanongong, right? And she's talking about all the political leaders who are incarcerated in Robben Island. And she's asking, the composition of that song is incredibly powerful and amazing, because she says, Bahleli bonke etilongweni, bahleli bonke kwanongqongqo, which basically says they are all imprisoned. And she then asks a very, very pertinent question of what have we done, right? And the culture and the history of the music becomes a very, very constant prayer, right? Where, and we see this again in the blues in the United States, where there's an intercession that's happening through the music, through the instruments, through the lyrical composition. There's this prayer to finally come to this promised land, right? And all of this comes up when you say, for instance, in this dark world that we're living in, people need light. And the question that I want to pose to you then as a result of that is to say, with the project that you're doing with your music, so not necessarily one album, but like your entire musical project from your first album right to your most recent album, how do you relate to that particular conception of the music as social healer, the musician as a social healer, rather, and how music begins to not only direct our attentions to the socio-political problems of our societies, but also begins to theorize them by insisting that we pay attention to that. There's on a previous episode of this podcast, I had a conversation with Jesse McCarthy, a professor of English and African American Studies here at Harvard, and in that conversation, the music of Letambulu comes up, and Letambulu in 1976, and this is during the Soweto student uprisings that lead to the massacre. Letambulu asks the question of why are the parents, our parents, afraid of their children, right? Again, demonstrating that point of let's pay attention to what is happening to blackness, what it means for blackness, wherein our own children have become unrecognizable to us. So I guess the question that I'm sitting with as I listen to your music and as I listen to you in the course of this conversation, I'm thinking about that question of what does it mean for you to think of the musician as healer and to think of the music as a tool of theorizing society?
What's the opposite of being a healer? I was trying to think of a word. What would be the opposite of being a healer?
That's a very good
I
question.
could look. I'm gonna look up antonyms for a healer. Hold on. I'm really curious. This is gonna be a powerful moment. Let's see.
Uh-huh.
Because I say that to say, if the music is not a healer,
What is it doing?
yeah. All right. Let's see. If it's not a healer, it's some powerful words. It's an injurer.
Mm-hmm.
It's an ailment.
Mm-hmm.
It's an assassin.
Uh-huh.
That's three powerful words right there. An injurer, an assassin, an ailment.
Mm.
I don't want to be any of those.
Uh-huh.
And I don't want our music to be
Conceptualized.
there you go, to be something that's conceptualized as injuring us as a people or
Assassinating.
us or assassinating us as a people. So it's like for people who may say, oh, you're putting too much pressure on music, you know, to say that it has to be a healer. It's like, well, if it's not a healer, then what is it, you know? And I think that when it comes to hip hop, which is what I have been born into the hip hop generation, and I have been listening to hip hop since before I even knew what I was listening to. Because of that, I understand that hip hop also has an autobiographical nature to it, to where it's like, hey, I'm speaking for a community. I'm a representative as an artist. I'm representing my city, my people, my culture, my state, my school, my specific neighborhood. So because of that, it's like this is clearly just not music that has no narrative attached to it. To where it's just like, oh, that's just violin, strings and just, a trumpet blowing. Okay, cool. It's like, no, this music has a narrative attached to it. So now that narrative is going to contribute to either having healing power or
Destructive power.
The power to injure, the power to assassinate. So anyone, that's my answer for anyone who tries to say that I'm putting too much pressure on music. And when it comes to the musicians, the people making the music, I also feel that we are leaders, and as leaders, in the Bible, it says that if you are intentionally leading people down the wrong path, God is going to judge you in an even harder way, especially if you're leading young, impressionable youth down the wrong path, then that is not something that is going to go unpunished. And with that being said, leaders don't just come in the form of musicians. Leaders come in the form of teachers, of barbers and beauticians, of pastors, of coaches. Leaders come in the form of course, musicians. We are just one of many, different types of leaders. So to act like there is no moral responsibility that comes along with being a leader, I think that is totally being blind to what comes with the territory. So anyone with a platform is a leader. Nowadays, if you have 100 followers on your Facebook page or on your Instagram page, you are a leader, because what's the opposite of a leader? A follower. And guess what we all are trying to get nowadays? More what?
Followers.
More followers. So why are you trying to get more followers, but
you're not going to lead, right?
Come on, my brother.
And I think that, one of the things you're touching on, and it's fascinating because, again, I'm gonna appeal back to another conversation that I had with Milton Curry, a colleague and a senior of mine, an academic, former dean, a professor of architecture, and he said something. I posed the question, and this is a question that I've been posing throughout the series, right? And the question is, in the South African context, in any case, what we often get is white circles, whiteness will say to us, white academics, white intelligentsia will say to us, divorce the political from the aesthetic, right? So music ought to be music for music's sake, right? And I appreciate the notion that, yes, if I'm listening to a piece of music, I don't necessarily need to be doing a philosophical analysis of the music, unpacking every single line. But I do think something is to be said about the absence of ideology is itself an ideology.
That makes sense.
And the absence of an ideology fundamentally seeks to substantiate, undergird, continue, perpetuate the ideology that existed previously. And I'll qualify that by saying that in South Africa we had an incredibly divisive socio-political structure of governance, apartheid. And what happens in our refusal to confront the political in the aesthetic is that we're saying the structures that were built by apartheid are good enough. We're happy with them. We don't want them to change. And so if we don't want them to change, don't talk about the fact that the music that is being produced is political. It's apolitical. Don't talk about the fact that what we're teaching in our schools is political. It's apolitical. It needs to be seen to be apolitical in order for the system to remain unchallenged. And I guess talking to the question of, am I putting too much pressure on the music if I'm asking it to have a moral directionality, right? I want to ask the question of, how do you, and this is now bringing us quite nicely back to your artistic project, how does D1 distinguish, like where do you, the music is informed by a moral directionality, but at the same time, you do have quite a popular following. People love your music, people enjoy your music for a number of reasons. And at some point, when you're in studio, I don't know, and I guess I'm asking for a bit of insight into your creative practice here. At what point do you say, underpinning all of these albums that I've done is a certain moral direction, but at the same time, I know how to compose a beat so that, I have a piece of music that is recently released and the most listened to on iTunes, on Spotify, on all of these platforms. At what point does the artist say, I understand my responsibility, but I want to produce a really, really cool artistic piece? Or does the fact of producing a really, really cool artistic piece rest on the fact that the moral directionality is always and ever present in the kind of work that you produce?
Oh, man, that's a great question. I'll answer the second part first, if that's okay. Artistic greatness cannot be substituted for moral righteousness. So just because something has a positive message in it, it can still be corny, it can still be whack, it can still be lame, it can still be horrible, honestly. Yeah. So I want to make that clear. To answer the first part of your question, that is the challenge, the beautiful struggle of being able to be an artist who does have moral directionality, in terms of where I want to take my art, but who still doesn't want to sacrifice the artistic colorfulness, and the artistic potency of creating something that makes people say, wow, artistically, this is great. Regardless of the message, artistically, this is great. That's the beautiful struggle, and that is the challenge that we should all, be excited about. If we're doing something with our lives that isn't challenging us, then we aren't doing the right thing with our lives. Because nothing that we are called to do
will ever be simple.
Will ever be simple. Even if it is lucrative, even if it is fun and fulfilling, it should never be so simple that it doesn't have some type of chip on our shoulder that we are like eager to overcome and succeed at. Correct. So that's the chip right there, is how to have mass appeal but still be able to go deep and have more than surface level appeal. So you want to go wide and deep. That's what I had to look myself in the mirror and say, is that my goal? Because I know some people who have a very small audience, but they are able to go very deep with those people, right? And with that audience. And that is successful by all means. That is still considered success, right? For me, I didn't want to be a person who just has very wide appeal, but who has only a surface level relationship with the people he appeals to. So I want to be as bold as possible in order to go deep, and as thorough as possible, but also as universal as possible. And what allows me to be universal is the fact that I just embrace my humanity. As a man, as a black man, as a human being, as a child of God, I have more in common with most people than what I don't have in common with them. There are so many levels that I can relate to just another human being on
Yeah.
Whether it's you, whether it's Adam, whether it's Professor Gates, no matter who it is, I can relate to people just because we are both human beings. So that allows me to have the universal appeal to a wide audience. But then it's my sincerity, it's my life experience, and it's my passion for my why and understanding why I am in the field of hip hop and why I am choosing to take on the role of being an edutainer, an educator, and an entertainer. It's the why and it's the passion that accompanies that why that causes me to go deep with people, deep in a way that may be uncomfortable sometimes for people. And that's okay, you know? You've actually been present for different conversations that I have been a part of to where it's like, hey, my stance or my approach to something may not resonate well with other people sometimes, but my passion and my sincerity behind it is still something that, it never makes me above having a conversation for clarity with people, because that is where true community is built.
And true learning.
And true learning is, exactly. So if I was ducking away from any conversations that may be had with people who feel differently than me, then I am now negating an awesome opportunity that exists for mutual learning to occur, you know? So that's number one. But number two, it's the passion that allows me to say, I want to stretch people. I want to stretch my audience, because what people will do in life is they will try to size you up really quickly. They'll say, okay, so where are you from? What are you doing here? Oh, this is your show, or this is your podcast? All right, cool. And real quick, I think human nature tries to put you into
A particular category.
a particular box that they can say, okay, I have him boxed in, and I have him in a safe space in my head to where I understand him. And now, because of that box that they put you in, they will limit themselves in terms of their experience with you, because now they'll say, well, wait, you belong in this box. How dare you try to talk to me about something outside of this box, you know? And I'm not here to have another human being think that they are going to predefine who I am and why I am the way I am.
And this brings me to, I think this conversation is exciting for me for a number of reasons, because I'm fascinated by so much that is associated with David, who I think to a certain extent exists in relation to and behind D1 the artist, right? Because, and this is the one thing that I wanted to kind of start with, is to say, well, who is the man, right? Who is doing this work of developing a very, very particular kind of message that is responsive to a society that is actively, especially in this country, killing black men, right? And in tandem with that, I want to talk to your most recent work. As you say, you released it last month. It's an exciting album, and I think a lot of your listenership was waiting for that particular project for a number of reasons. But I'm curious about, in relation to, we know the human, right? We know who David is. I think my particular audience that I am bringing to this conversation is now like, oh, okay, I get the rapper, but now I know the man. The man grows up in New Orleans. He's a church boy, but he has a spiritual awakening as a result of having to confront the existential reality of being male and black in the United States. So considering all of that, bringing it to your latest project, tell us a bit more about what it is that informed your latest project, why this particular project at this particular juncture, and how it is that this album continues to draw from the experiences, the histories, and I would even call them histories of subversion, because when you come into hip-hop, you're subverting a lot of what is expected of hip-hop artists. You're saying, I get that, I'm down with that, but it's not what I want to do. This is not the message that I'm planning on. So I'm interested in understanding rather that particular history as it bears on this recent project and album.
Right. So the title alone is very powerful. The title of my album is God and Girls, Part 2. Those are the two most powerful forces in this world. God and girls, right? There needs to be a respect level put on spirituality and on women that I think is enough to make sure that the amount of respect that we put on those two topics right there will be able to honestly solve a lot of the problems that we have in this world. So that's why I dedicated the whole album to two concepts. The concept of God, spirituality, purpose, you know, getting an understanding for our spiritual beings and who we come from. And girls, you know, women, I'm talking about, but from childhood and understanding how we should be respecting women, how we should be glorifying the beauty of women, not commodifying the beauty of women. You know, how we should be protecting women, how we should be honoring women, coexisting with women, instead of just complaining about women or you know, getting to the point to where we are objectifying women. So me even putting that title out there, it's like me putting a flag in the ground saying, I'm prioritizing what's most important in life. And I can't think of anything that's more important than God first, but then, you know, women being second. So when I put this album out, every song on the album is truly an act of transparency, to where anyone who listens to this album is going to understand my why even more, as far as why I am who I am, because these songs are just chapters in my life story. You know, these are real relationships that I have been in with people, with women, and certain experiences that I've drawn from those. These are different conversations that I've had with God and different conversations that I've had with myself, or revelations that I've had within myself about God. And I just put them in musical form on top of really, really, really nice beats that are sonically pleasing to the ear. But these autobiographical tales are going to really like sit with people in a way that this album will be able to be played in 20 years and it can still have the power that it has right now. Yes, yes.
And this takes me to one of the points that I make in a piece titled Khawuleza, an Instantiation of the Black Archive, right, where I conceptualize the notion of a musical score as a method of encoding history, right? So music becomes the vehicle of historical narrative, right? Especially so the reason why I make that conceptual move is because of two things. The first is I come from a highly oral culture, right? Where it is poetry, it is music, it is prose, and that oral culture is constantly passed on from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next, to a point where, you know, for example, one can trace back their lineage 500 years without necessarily having to go to a library to trace, who was my father, who was my great-grandfather, and, you know, both from a patrilineal and matrilineal line, right? If you know, as the one thing that I, having had been at Harvard, and the one thing that I'm constantly confronted by is back at home, and there are a few of us, not a lot of us, because I think the tradition is dying. But the one thing that I think for me is so interesting is there's this line that I keep on having at the back of my mind to say, we need to know our names, know your names. And that comes from two things. The first is what I conceptualize to be an ontological misrecognition. A lot of folks in the United States of America mispronounce my name.
What's the proper pronunciation?
Siseko.
Sisego.
Yeah, Siseko Khumalo, yeah. And that mispronunciation kind of takes me to, well, what does it mean to know oneself? What does it mean to know one's names? What does it mean to trace one's history through orature, right? And that's where the concept of scoring history through music comes up and through orature, because, you know, and forgive me, I'll lose you for a second here, but for example, you know, just to demonstrate the point, one can, in tracing the what do you call it, the histories of the southernmost tip of the African continent through one's family lineage, for example, one recalls the wars, the disruptions, the ruptures, for example, of a historical moment which we know as Imfecane back at home, right? So when we recite the clan names of the Khumalo, what is it, of the Khumalo family, we say, Nina bezikhali zamantungwa ezawela iZambezi igcwele, right? The war regimen of Mzilikazi that crossed the Zambezi to KwaBulawayo. And the fact that KwaBulawayo becomes KwaBulawayo in Zimbabwe, you know, there's a really, really cool composition in the oral histories where we say, yena uMzilikazi omuzi wakhe wagcotshwa ngegazi lesitha sakhe, right? Mzilikazi, whose house was christened by the blood of his enemies, which gives us the name KwaBulawayo. So you have a history of naming that also speaks to the landscape, right? So there is a dialogical conversation that's happening with landscape in that particular instance. But to return to the work that you're doing in the album, which is the prioritization of both spirituality, but also the feminine energy in terms of your own history with the relationships that you've had, how do you conceptualize the process of this history writing that you're doing, right? Because it's another form of historiography. If we take seriously your project as both an aesthetic but also as a philosophical project, it has implications for historiography, right? Because one can, as you say, in 20 years, in 50 years, turn to this album and say, okay, how do I situate the character of David? And to an extent, this is, I suppose, the reason why I do this kind of historical work of situating how the function of orature speaks to the landscape and the landscape speaks back to being, personhood, right? As we find it on the southernmost tip of the African continent, is because of this. Because when I take those names today, names that existed 200, 300 years ago, I am locating myself in a particular part of the world, as that particular part of the world was defined by the actions of men and women who existed in that world at the time. And 50 years from today, someone could do that with your work, with the music that you're doing right now, which is to say they could situate David in a particular part of the world with particular histories and particular inflections of what those histories mean in relation to the person. So did you go into this project kind of thinking about that to say, this is another mode of historiography? Or did you go into the project thinking, I'm telling a story, my story, and trying at the same time as I'm telling the story to create really good music?
I think at this point I'm aware that, I know at this point that when I'm telling my story, it is a story that a lot of people can relate to. So that empowers me to want to tell my story even more, because I understand that many people, they haven't heard their story told musically before, and I'll give them permission to know that it's going to be all right. If you've been through this as well, it's going to be all right. And you are not lost. In fact, you are quite normal, you know, in terms of this story being a part of your journey. So that's what really motivates me to tell stories, because there's people that are going through these same life journeys as me, and they just need someone to let them know, like, it's okay, man. Like, don't trip. It's okay. But B, there's people who haven't gone through it yet, and it may be ahead of its time. But when they listen to it, and if I make the music good, if the music is good enough, they're gonna stay tuned and listen to it, right? Then, whenever they do go through something similar to this in their lives,
they've got a reference point.
You know what? I read about this before. I heard about this before. D1 talked to me about this. So that's why it's very important that the stories that I tell have a sort of context that is connected to something bigger that I represent and stand for. Because if I just tell you a story and then I just leave it as a cliffhanger at the end, or if you don't understand how I approach life and you don't understand my worldview, then these stories alone, if you just simply listen to a song, you pick a random song and listen to it, you might be like, whoa, so where do I go from here? And I really care about not leaving my listeners out on an island to have to figure out life for themselves. So that's what mission vision is. So when I say mission vision is the lifestyle that accompanies everything that I do. Mission vision is all about three things. It's all about being real, being righteous, and being relevant at all times. So no matter what season you may be in, it may be a peak in your life, it may be a valley in your life. You might listen to my songs, a song like Convos with God on my album. That's talking about a deep, dark valley in my life, right? You might hear a song like Till the Wheels Fall Off. That's talking about a peak in my life. Whether it's a peak or a valley, understanding that the goal is to be real, be righteous, and be relevant at all times helps you understand how to navigate that peak. You know, being real is about being authentic at all times and about truly loving yourself, right?
Yeah.
So whether things are going well
or not so well,
being real is essential at all times. Being righteous is about knowing that doing the right thing in life is always right, even if the world isn't celebrating you for it. Even if things are quote unquote going bad at the time, still doing what you know is morally righteous in your heart and right according to God and according to God's word. Being righteous is always the best route. Even if on social media it's not the popular thing to do. You know, even if you want to be a young rapper coming from New Orleans and it's not popular to say, well, I'm going to go the route where I choose to not glorify murder and drug dealing and disrespectful behavior towards women. Even if you are doing that and it may not be popular at the time, if it's righteous, it's still the way to go. You know, that's important for people to know and understand. Even when you're at the top and when you feel invincible, hey, you feel invincible, but it's still important to be righteous because the wrong mistake could
cost you a hell of a lot.
Big time,
yeah.
you know?
Yeah,
So
no, for
that's
sure.
that's what mission vision is all about. And being real, righteous, and to be relevant. Being relevant is all about understanding that you have to work hard to stand out at whatever it is that you do in life. And that's what makes you relevant is, wow, you've put in the work, the extra energy that it takes in order to stand out from the crowd at what you do. So that defines what mission vision is all about. And mission vision is something that I want my more so than wanting people to listen to my music and memorize the lyrics to my music, I want people to be drawn in through my music. That's the entry point to a relationship with me. But I want you to ultimately live your life with mission vision. Because when you live your life with mission vision, you maximize your existence here on earth and you make this world a better place. And that right there, we all winning at that point.
This brings me to the point of the connection between, and we spoke about it briefly, your music and the role of being able to educate, but having a platform or using a medium whereby what it is that you're teaching is not just confined to a particular classroom, to a particular community, but rather goes out further. I'm interested in how you view the function of education, educating through your music, being the practical example at your level, in shaping the function of education in shaping African American communities, right? And I ask this question in the context of your teaching background, the historical realities of African American schools being underfunded, and the narrative that kind of then says education is your gateway out, right? So through education, you have these amazing opportunities that are thrown at you. And to an extent, the narrative is real, to an extent, because I find myself at Harvard University as a boy of the rural outback of KZN in South Africa because of the ways in which I have leveraged education, right? So I'm not in the least trying to kind of downplay how education does, or the narrative of education as the vehicle to success having legitimacy, but I'm interested here in, again, taking your background of being an educator, transitioning from a classroom educator to being an educator with a popular medium. How do you envision the role and function of education in African American communities? I know it's a big question.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about your thoughts on that. Yeah.
Right. So the role and function of education in African American communities.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, we should take ownership of education,
Mm-hmm.
meaning that we have firsthand resources, which are our elders.
Yes.
That it is absolutely imperative that we tap into for knowledge.
Yeah.
And for information.
Do you know what that just reminds me of? I'm so sorry to interject, but it actually reminds me of Kiesi Lehman's Heavy. I don't know if you know the book, but he talks about, and he's writing about his autobiographical kind of theory development. And the one thing that I'm drawn to, just as you're speaking, he's talking about his grandmother and how, as a kid growing up, he kind of sees his grandmother as a tool, as a resource, as a repository of knowledge, but how she never sees herself in that way, right? So she would always, and he says this, she would always say, you know, I don't have the kind of education that you have. I'm not as, and yet for him, both as a young person and as a professor nowadays of literature, I believe he teaches literature, he's still kind of, his image of what the first point of contact in terms of learning and knowledge is his grandmother. Mm-hmm. Sorry, yes, you were saying our resources, our most immediate.
Most definitely. That is something that we have to embrace. That may come in the form of grandparents. I've been blessed that on my father's side, I had access to my grandparents for much of my life. They actually co-raised me, you know. My grandfather is still alive. He's 92 years old currently.
God bless his soul.
Oh my gosh, man, I tap into him. I just want him to tell his story, you know, and to just tell me all of the stories that he can think of and remember, and what his perspective is on how life is nowadays, letting me know how life was back then. I did the same thing with my grandmother before she passed, and that is one role that we have to play in terms of understanding the importance of education in our community, is understanding where that education should come from, and it should come from within, you know, so that's number one. In terms of understanding the importance as well, just like the word healing, healer had an opposite word, which was injurer or assassin or, you know, ailment, you know, we have to think, what is the opposite of education? It would be ignorance. It would be miseducation. And there is always a price to pay for not doing something. So if we choose not to embrace education or not to be educators, then the price we will pay is ignorance and miseducation. And we have to ask ourselves, is that an outcome that we desire? And if it's not, then it's very simple. Let's do the work we need to do to embrace education and to be educators of our own.
David, as a last question, wrapping up.
I got goosebumps just now. We talking that talk right now. We talking that talk.
As a last question to wrap up, I wonder, you've got a huge platform, and you've got a lot of people who are looking in, right? And one of the things that I appreciate about how you relate to your fan base is you kind of break the fourth wall, right? If we use theater speak, and you allow, as you say, the transparency, right? What is it that you want your audience, your listenership, your fans to take from this experience of being invited into your journey? Because your journey is complex. It's, yes, you're a musician, but also you're working with very particular projects, for example, the mentorship of boys and young men to become upright and, good standing citizens. There's a lot of stuff that defines the work that you do. And say, for example, I'm just a crazy fan. I haven't had this conversation. I'm not at Harvard. I don't know D1 other than his music and the snippets of the conversations that I have with him on his Insta Live, interacting with you on the Twitter timeline. That's the only experience that I have of you. What do you want me to understand and appreciate about your artistic project? What's the one thing? If I were to say, I got an insight into David, not as somebody, again, who is in constant communication, in community with him, but as somebody who's in community with him virtually. What do you want me to know about the intention behind your artistic project?
That's an amazing question. It has two answers. One answer is that I would want you to know that my intention behind all of my artistic projects is to make God proud of the time he has given David on this earth and the talent that he has blessed David with. That would be one intention that I want my audience to take away from my artistic projects. The second intention would be for the consumer, the person receiving and experiencing my art, it would be for them to be able to become more motivated to maximize their existence and to understand who they are truly living this life to please based on listening to my music. Are they living this life to simply please others? Are they living this life to please themselves? Or are they living this life to please God? And through being able to define that order and to properly prioritize, I feel like I would have helped my listener, live a more purpose-driven life. And that would be my two goals.
I love that. And I love it just because of the conversation that we've had and how it circles back to your underscoring the importance of the fact that the world is in need of light. Considering the conflict in the Gaza Strip, considering the war and the aggression of Russia in the Ukraine, I think this takeaway is a beautiful one to think about what it is that we can do in our own communities where our democracies are buckling, where ideals and principles that we have held as sacrosanct and untouchable are being attacked and are being contested. So thank you for an insightful and incredibly rich conversation. Folks, join us for the next episode. And in this episode, in the upcoming episode, we will have an exciting conversation of African philosophers where we have identified an exciting opportunity to talk to the lack of African philosophy in the greater northeastern schools, and thinking with colleagues both here in the United States as well as colleagues from Europe who are specializing in African philosophy. Catch us next time on the Black Archive Visual Podcast. This is me, your host, Sisego Kumalo, signing out. Thank you.